Hello everybody, thanks for joining today. My name is Mike Bird and you are watching Forged in PowerShell, the single best channel on YouTube for all things PowerShell related. Great to have you here today. Today we're going to learn a little bit about PowerShell and working with web resources through PowerShell. So if you're coming from kind of a traditional administration background, systems administration, other roles specific to IT professionals, there may be times that you need to consume resources from the web. So you may need to scrape data from the web. You may need to interact with an API to retrieve information, or you may need to post data to the web, right? So these are all things that are more than capable inside of PowerShell. And so let's go ahead and just get started. We're gonna fire up PowerShell here. Version 7 is what I'm running. And if you remember from our introduction video, one of the first things that I try to teach about is that all commands are, I'm not going to say all commands, most commands that you're going to deal with are part of a module, right? So they're commands that are developed inside of a single module, and that's how they're made available to you inside of PowerShell. So if we look at, first of all, the modules that are loaded again, right? If you remember, this was one of the first commands that we learned previously. Get module shows a couple of modules that are available to us. One's PowerShell.management, the other one's PS readline, right? So there's commands that are inside of these that are available to us to use. But what if we want to work with, say, certain commands that were built for the web to be used there? Well, the parameter on here that I did not show you before was the flag called list available, right? And so list available actually retrieves a listing of all modules that are available to you. There's specifically a module path where all modules will get loaded into, and these are modules that are available to you. And prior to version 3 of PowerShell, you actually had to import these modules. So anytime you wanted to use, let's say, a command that was not inside of your base session, right? If it was not in there, you had to specifically run a command called import module, the name of that module, to pull those commands in, and they would be available to you at that point. Well, starting in version 3 of PowerShell, they are dynamically loaded, right? So if you call upon a command that exists in the catalog, right? So in that module catalog, if it exists, it will load it dynamically on the fly and make it available to you. So you can see that we've only got a couple of modules available to us that are actually loaded as part of the session. But if we actually use the list available flag, that will tell us all modules that are available to us that they'll actually be loaded in dynamically the first time we call a command from that module. So if we say list available and we run this, you can see that right now it's compiling all of that information, and we'll see here in just a second. So you can see these are all of the different modules, okay, that are available to me. So you can see a bunch of modules related to Azure, other modules that are specific to kind of core PowerShell modules that are available to us. And so all of these are actually available to us. It's just they're not loaded in at the beginning of the session. But the first time you call, say, a command that's inside of one of these, it will dynamically load it in. So we're going to look at today primarily two commands we're going to look at today. They're called invoke web request and invoke REST method. So these are the two commands we're going to look at today, and they're both great commands on working with the web, and will kind of help you as you need to consume information from the web, or if you need to post data specific to specific endpoints on the web as well. So let's start first of all with invoke web request, right? So you can see I can tab autocomplete that, and if we look at, even before we actually run it, if you remember from our first video, we had get command. That was another command we learned on our introduction. And let's go ahead and pass it the invoke web request. And if we run that, you can see here's the command. You can see a command type, and you can see the source. right? So that's the module where we're pulling this from. Just like I was saying before, that module didn't appear originally when we looked at our Get module list. But if you look at it now, you can see that the utility module is now in there. And that's because I actually utilized a command from that module and dynamically loaded it. And so now it's in our running session, okay? So let's go ahead and look at invoke web request. So one of the first, obviously the most common parameter that will need to be set for this is a specific URI. So the web resource endpoint that you're going to be pointing to issue a web request again. So for now, we're not going to issue anything else other than just a single URI that we can pass, right? So let's start for now. Let's go ahead and just look at google.com, okay? So you can see that it actually went out, did a GET request. You can actually see all of the web request details that came back from that, right? So let's go ahead and store this in a variable. And variables we'll learn a little bit more about in a coming video, but for now, just know that we're just going to call this response, okay? So we're going to take the output from invoke web request, we're going to assign it to this variable response, okay? So if we look at response now, okay, and we output that, we can see that this is all of the data that is available to us as part of that request. So we can see a status code description, right, of that status. We have the actual content itself that was returned. You can see the headers. We have a listing of headers, the images. All right, so if we wanted to find just the images themselves, we could retrieve those from this object, right? Now, you may be asking, okay, great, what is the total set of data that's available to me through PowerShell that I can return here, right? Because right now what you're seeing in this output is just a small set of the total amount of data that's basically in this object, right? In this response object. So we're going to learn a little bit about get member, okay? Get member will actually look at the object details, and it will provide an output of all of the object properties that are available to us to consume. And so we're going to take the output of response, which is the object, the object that we just retrieved. We're going to pass that to get member, and get member will tell us what is the object, first of all, that we're looking at. And you can see the type. This is the actual type name of the PowerShell object, and you can see the properties below that. And again, remember, PowerShell, unlike say other types of shells or shells where we can do scripting, such as a bash shell, for example, or any type of bash scripts, is that PowerShell we're actually dealing with objects that we're passing between the pipeline here, right? So you can see this pipe between response and get member. So unlike kind of standard input, standard output, which is we're passing just a bunch of strings across the pipelines, PowerShell, we're actually passing full fidelity objects, okay, from command to command. And so it's a fantastic way if you don't want to deal with a whole bunch of parsing and challenges and potentially getting to the right data inside of a bunch of string data that's just simply being passed in and out of commands, say in other types of shells that you may be more accustomed to. So you can see here though that one of the properties we can look at is the headers. So we can pass this to a command called select object. Select object will actually take the object that was passed to it, and you can select specific properties out of it, right? So let's go ahead and look at, I want to return the headers. Let's just look at the headers to start, okay? So we can see a listing of the headers that are actually inside of this object. What if we want to look at the images, okay? You can see the actual images. Now, if we expand, okay, if we actually expand that property, you can see the actual tag name, the outer HTML. We can see the alt text that's associated with it also. You can see the full source, of the Google image right on their homepage, right? So again, all of this is available to you through Select Object. Now, there's other ways to retrieve these object properties also, but I'm going to try to stick to the PowerShell recommended approach as to how you get these properties back for right now. So that is invoke web request, okay? There may be times though when you want to retrieve, say, data from a REST API, right? And now this is not going to be a video about REST and that style of API, but there's plenty of resources out there if you want to learn more about REST APIs. But just know a REST API is a web resource that we want to, basically we want to be able to query to retrieve data from, and most typically, although it doesn't have to be this way, but typically REST APIs will return data in the form of JSON, right? So JSON is a data serialization format, okay, that can be returned to us. And one of the super nice things about PowerShell, especially this command we're going to look at next, is invoke REST method, is that it takes a lot of the work out of having to return a JSON string. And again, same thing like we were talking about before, where you've got to parse through it and everything. It turns that JSON string into a PowerShell object that can be queried, and properties can be selected just like we did in the command above here. So invoke REST method. Let's go ahead and try. I want to show you let's go ahead and look at a different resource here. Okay, so we want to look at, let's look at our JSON. So there's a place called JSON placeholder where there's a bunch of free APIs you can test against if you'd like. So we're going to run down here towards the bottom. You can see these are the resources that are available to us. So we've got posts, comments, albums, photos, to-dos, and users, right? So we're going to leverage PowerShell, and let's go ahead and get let's look at this real quick. So here's the post, and again, you can see just through the browser what this content looks like, okay? So this is the JSON string that's being returned to us. It's a formatted string, and you can kind of see what this looks like, right? So we want to go in and essentially retrieve it using PowerShell. So let's go ahead and put let's put the URI in here. And we're going to say specifically this is a get method. Now, HTTP has a few different methods that are supported. A get in this case is if we're trying to retrieve information from a web resource, which we are. So we're going to go ahead and use the get method. We're going to store this also in, let's call this in our REST object, okay? Again, not going to spend too much time on variables today, but just so you know, we're creating a variable called REST. We're going to assign this to it. Okay, so same thing. Now when we look at REST, look what happened here. So first of all is, if you remember from our previous command, if we look at, what was it called, response, okay? Response has a, let's do it this way. Let me do the same. I want to use invoke web request this time. And I want to show you the same response using this command. Okay. Okay. So if we look at response now, and we look at the content, okay? And again, let's use the select object, expand property, content. Okay. You can see here is the actual, if you remember when we were looking at this through the browser, it's the same thing, okay? So you can see here, this is the JSON object that we just returned, okay? Well, here's the thing. It's kind of like, well, can I work with this data in an object form and not so much just in a formatted string? Well, so PowerShell has a commandlet called convert from JSON, okay? So again, remember, we're going to take our response, we're going to pass it to select object, we're going to select just a specific property out of there, which is content, and we're then going to pass that to our convert from JSON, right? And when we look at this here, you'll notice that we have a full fidelity PowerShell object now that we can query. And if you remember when we looked at get member shows this as a PS custom object, and look at those properties that we have access to now. We've got the ID, the title, the user ID, and again now we can just select it like we were doing on our previous object above, which is, let's get let's see, I want to get the ID and the user ID. Okay, just like that, we have a new object that we've created from a JSON string that we've used right here. So pretty cool. Now, so this was invoke web request. If you remember, that's how we did this. Here's the nice thing about invoke REST method. So REST, again, that was the other request we did to the same resource. Look at this. So we just returned output of the variable from invoke REST method, and it's already formatted into a PowerShell object, right? So you don't have to go through the selecting of specific data fields out of it and then converting those from, say, JSON to a PowerShell object. Invoke REST method does that automatically because it's expecting that we're going to be interrogating a REST API, obviously in the command name. And so it's already expecting JSON coming back, and so it does that conversion for you, which is super nice. Again, we've got REST. We can do the same thing. We can select our properties out of it. If we remember, I'll do the exact same ones we had before, user ID, and I'll include title also, right? Just like that, okay? So that is how invoke web request and invoke REST method work. Let's go ahead and take a look at one more. Let's look at something. Let's look at our photos here, okay? So again, another endpoint. Let's use invoke REST method. Let's use, okay, our new URI. We're going to still be leveraging the get HTTP method. Let's go ahead and store this in a variable again. We're going to call this photos. Okay, now we're going to learn another command today. This time what I want to do is so I've got a photos object. Now if you looked at before, on this page it says we had 5,000 photos in here, okay? So is there a way that I can kind of determine that, right? What the size of this object is or what the composition of it is, you know, how many objects are inside of this. So if we have a command called measure object, and measure object will essentially take a command, an output that's fed to it, and provide some statistics on it, right? So if we run this, you can see that, again, depending on the specific data properties that we're sending to it, there's other types of mathematical functions that we can apply to it. But for now, we're just looking at count. And you can see that we have 5,000 objects inside of this. Let's say that I want to select just the first one. Okay, again, we're going to go back to select object, and we're going to say first one. Okay, that's the first object in that object array that we have that's available to us. If let's say I want to select the first 10, okay, we can do that. I want to get 10 of these. Let's say that that's great, but I want the first 10, but I only want the album ID. Okay, just like that. And so, as you can kind of see here, we're using these same commands in multiple ways to get different, to basically change the functionality and the output that we're receiving from this. So those are a couple of new commands for today that we're teaching you a little bit about on working with the web. So the two commands today were invoke web request and invoke REST method, both which are going to be, honestly, these two commands can go a long ways for you if you're having to do any work on the web that you need to retrieve or possibly post data to the web also. Thanks for joining today. My name is Mike Bird again, and this is Forged in PowerShell. Thanks for joining. Make sure you subscribe, ring the bell so you receive notifications when new content is uploaded, and have a wonderful day. Thank you.